quilty friends, how are ya? I am happy to welcome you all to our second quilt along for the Jelly Rolls quilt group. I am excited to get started. I know we've had a slight delay. I was supposed to do this yesterday, but life happens sometimes. But I know several of you have gotten started. I had the hardest time even just selecting. I had a couple that had it narrowed down, but I couldn't make a decision, and I decided to just wait a day, and we're going to get started now. So this is the one we're going with. This is a Robin Pickens jelly roll. This particular one is called Blushing Peonies, and then I've got some matching, it's what this background fabric coordinates, but it was not part of this particular line. So I've already gone ahead and cut a width of fabric strip from this in the 2.5 inch size. That's what we're going to do. We're working on the quilt that we found. I think it was called a Granny Squares quilt tutorial. I found it on the quiltylove.com site, and it is a free tutorial. There's not really, from what I have learned, there used to be a PDF pattern that has stopped functioning for some reason, and I wasn't able to get information to get that back up, but we don't need it in order to quilt, so we're just going to keep going. The directions are on there, the fabric, what measurements are all on there. The quilt says that it's about 60 inches by 72 inches, and that we need a certain number of 2.5 inch blocks per 2.5 inch squares per quilt block. We're going to go ahead and cut those here today, and we'll just talk about that for a minute. I'm going to start by cutting my background fabric. We're going to need 13 background squares. We're going to end up cutting the background down a little bit, so all of these squares are going to turn into triangles. The reason this matters is all of those edges, once we've cut them, are going to be bias edges, and we would be smart if we would go ahead and starch them just a little bit. That's going to stabilize them. They're not going to stretch as much. They're going to be easier to sew downstream. So the first thing I'm going to do is press this strip out, and I'm going to use a little bit of starch. I'm using Best Press today. You use your starch or homemade version of Best Press if you'd like, but we're just going to press it out real quick. Iron is hot. Sewing on the bias isn't difficult, but pressing it ahead of time, making sure that that fabric is a little stiffer, makes it a whole lot easier. It makes it to where those edges can't stretch and skew as well. Yes, they'll still move if you pull. This isn't a heavy starch. This is kind of light, but it does make it a little bit stiffer, and it helps to just give it some more body. The benefit to pressing this now is that we're going to cut the fabric. It's already going to be stiffened. Those bias edges, when we get to them, shouldn't matter. They shouldn't be able to allow our squares to skew too much. Goodness, the mist sometimes when I'm talking just makes me breathe in just a teeny bit of that mist, and so I'm not sick, I promise. Almost done. Again, the squares in the middle, the 2.5 inch squares, we don't necessarily have to starch all of those. I do if I end up pressing out you know, the fold lines and things. I end up starching those just out of habit, but these are going to be regular squares, whatever colors we decide we want for the middle. It's just the outside background fabric that we're going to want to make sure we're careful with for starching purposes. So I started quilting 20 some years ago, about 20, just over 20 years. And back in the day, I started collecting rulers, and I did it kind of small, and I did it kind of cheap. So I know the OmniGrid ones didn't used to be this as expensive as they seem to be now, and I know that because we were broke. We had 2 little kids, and I didn't have a ton of money to spend on it. So I have a bunch of these OmniGrid rulers, and I'm going to use those today. There's no particular reason other than that's what I could afford at the time. All the different brands seem to have their benefits. I have a tendency to use the grid lines on the ruler to line everything out straight. And then it just so happens, since we're doing 2.5 inch squares, that I do have a 2.5 inch ruler that does make it a little faster, so I'm just going to be able to pop these out real fast. So we need 13 of these for the one block. Now I know I'm only doing one block with you tonight, but I'm going to cut the whole strip down. One strip should give us 16 squares. Why does this matter? Well, we're going to do a whole bunch of these, right? We have about 30 different blocks total. So we need 13 for one block, but we need 30 total. Now I could sit here and pre-cut everything, but I don't tend to do that, especially when things can be mixed and matched, and you might not need the whole jelly roll for the one quilt. So I don't necessarily want to cut all the strips down as small as they can get, just because they may not be needed for this quilt. I might need a longer section of fabric for the next thing I do. I do these. Jelly roll quilts are fun, but I also love to scrap quilt. So sometimes I need things that are different sizes. I've been working slowly on a couple other things. I have a, pardon me, I have a different group. We're working on a Lori Holt vintage Christmas thing. I haven't worked on that recently, but we're going to get started on that again soon. But some of these little scraps will work well for those quilt pieces. Get down to the middle of that strip and it's just a little too small for two, but it'll work one just fine. So I'll cut that down. Tiny little scraps. We'll save those for later. All right, that one's done. Now I need to design my square. So if we think about what this is going to look like, these are all just on the outside background area. I need to pick a couple different fabrics that are going to go in the middle. So I'm going to pick a center color, and this one I'm going to kind of radiate out. So I need 3 different colors. I need a center block. I'm going to use one of these. I need 4 squares of a middle row, and so I think for that I'm going to do something a little brighter. I think I might go with one of these greens. That one's cool. And then I need an outer ring, and I think for the outer ring I'm going to go dark. Let's see. Just trying to make sure I'm not using the exact same print here. Not that it matters much, but there we go. I've got 3 colors. I'm going to set all these other ones aside for now. So for this particular quilt, I need 1 for the middle. I need 1 for the very center block, 4 for the middle of the block, but not the very center, and then 8 surrounding blocks, and then all of those are going to be wrapped in with this quilt. So we're going to do 8 of these outer blocks, and I'll just cut the selvage off. Since these strips are fairly flat, I don't have to worry too much about pressing right this minute. Just going to cut off the selvage. And since I'm right-handed, I tend to flip my strips over. I'm going to cut 8 of these real quick. Now the last one we did, I had a tiny bit of issue with some of my strips not being exactly where I thought they were, but I'm using this 2.5 inch ruler, and it's real easy to see that from the inside of the valley to the inside of the valley is 2.5 inches. So I just need to make sure I'm sewing it from the proper angle so that my squares will all be aligned properly, and I won't have to trim as much as I did on the last quilt. One more. So those are all my outer blocks. I'll set this aside for later. I need 4 out of this print. Again, just remove my selvage. Then cut 2 sets here. Since this fabric is still folded in half, I'm cutting 2 with each swipe. 1. 2, and then I really only need 1 of this white, so I'm going to remove the selvage. I'm going to cut just 1 square. Kind of cutting backwards, but just need 1, so there we go, 1 square. Now, let's lay this out so we know what we're doing. The center of the quilt is a single square. On all 4 sides of that, we're going to lay out one of our middle row. So 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay. Around that, we need our outer ring. So 1, 2, 3, 4. Right in here, in these 4 corner patches, we're going to use the other 4 of these blocks. So 1, 2, 3, 4. Then, right here, whoops, that might need just a tiny bit of a press. Steam work in there, that was right on the edges where that, whoops, I folded that in half, didn't I? Silly me. Pressed a line in there, we'll straighten that out. That one's a little bit more bent up too. Okay. Alright, that ought to do. So we'll go here, we'll go here. There. Sometimes I get a little bit of lint from these jelly rolls, huh? Okay, so everything here is ready to go. We just need 1 more row with the background fabrics, and we're just going to do the same thing. We're going to add 1 to either end here, add 1 to either end here, and then right here. We're going to just fill in the lines a little bit, so now there's a straight row. Alright, so you can kind of see it's on point, but it's in rows this way. Later we're going to turn the block after it's sewn and we're going to trim it up, but we're going to start with this. And so what I'm going to do is just take 2 pieces and stitch them together. And we're going to just use a 1/4 inch line. I'm just going to keep going. So we're just going to chain piece these together. And it'll take a minute to snip a couple of these apart. Wondered where my snippers went. There's a reason I wear these around my neck. They're harder to lose. Alright. So the first one belongs here. Here. Make sure you get it in the right spot. Second one goes here. I'm going to go ahead and sew these 2 together. So just lining out that cut edge, 1/4 inch seam. Alright. Now I'm going to snip here. This one belongs here. This one is a 7th piece, so it's an odd number. So we're going to just add that on to the end here. And then I keep these little scraps of fabric to just keep the thread. You know, my other machine cuts the thread for me if I step on the presser foot right. I haven't had it as long. It's a little bit louder. And the other one has the added benefit of it having you can use your leg and push it sideways so that it'll lift the foot for you. So there's a little bar on the side that hangs down. It's a Juki to lift the foot up and down, the presser foot up and down for me. But I like to stand a lot, and so that's less of a benefit here in the kitchen. It works pretty well if I'm actually using my sewing table downstairs, but I live in Alaska and that downstairs level is a little colder than I'd like to be for this. Plus, there's not a good way to film it since I sew up against a wall. So that is my first row of 7 done. You can see all the seam allowances on here. I'm going to press all the seam allowances in one direction. We're going to do that in the entirety of this quilt. Spray with a little starch. So one row is going to go one direction. The next row is going to go the opposite direction. So just for fun, I'm going to press everything to the left. Finger press that. Add a little heat. Do the same thing. Finger press this one and then pop it over. Just going to do that with each one. Lay them down the direction I want them and then pop some steam on there. Okay, there's a little bit of pressure. That's why they call it pressing. 2 more. Lay that down, lift and push. And just don't burn yourself. Those irons get hot. All right, pressing is done for that row. It wasn't so bad. First row accomplished. 7 little blocks. Okay. One looks like I skewed it just a little bit, so I'm going to straighten it up and repress. Even when you're pressing, sometimes you manage to let it wiggle just a little bit. There we go. I just didn't open it as far as I should have on the one seam. No matter how long I've done this, there's always some little mistakes to be made, but they're easy to fix. Okay, so we've got a straighter line. So that one's done. We're gonna jump to the next row up. Sew these 2 together. And then these 2. For my own sake, I'm going to put this in here. And this row is identical, so I'm going to do these 2. Line those up and stitch. Joys of simple squares being cut the same size, they line up real easy, so this is kind of quick. And another. I try when I'm lining up those pinked edges to make sure that one side's pinked and one side isn't. The squares themselves tend to match up real well, but then I have a straight edge to follow the sewing on. Throw this in there. And we'll snip. All right. This one goes here. This one, oops, I put that in backwards. What am I doing? Goes here, and then this one's going to sew onto that. So add this piece. same thing on this next row. Just open that up. This one up, this one's going to go with this. So just line it all out, one by one. Alrighty. Now these two strips are the same, so this one goes here, this one goes here. We just have one more row to join, so one more seam in that row to join. Turn that into a row of 5. Do it again. These snips a long time ago, and I really like them for snipping apart these blocks. Alrighty, we're going to press out these rows again. So another way to press these open is to keep the seam allowances face down. Kind of finger press them all into place. This one's a little smaller, so it'll fit on my little ironing mat. A lot of people have switched to the wool mats. I just keep going with the same old standard because it hasn't failed me so far. Making sure that those are nice and open. It looks nice and straight. So my seam allowances on this bottom piece, they're all going to go that way. My seam allowances on both of these rows are going to go in the opposite direction. So I'm going to spin this, thankfully the same on both sides, but now my seam allowances all face this way. Okay, so that row's done. One more to press. And just flip from underneath, stretch them out, little tiny finger press, tiny bit of starch. Hold everything still, make it nice and crisp. Just seam by seam, press along. Alright, check the seam allowances, make sure they're facing the right direction. Alright, I've got a row of 3 here, so I'm going to make that happen real quick. This one. This one's bordered by our background fabric on both sides. Stay. Do that again one more time. There's really no right or wrong to these as long as you're sewing the strips in some semblance of a pattern that you can follow, as long as you get, it goes 1 3 5 7 5 3 1. Okay, so get all of our blocks done. I'm going to press these to the one side again. We'll make sure they're facing the right direction here in a minute. So this one, they all went that way. These two are going to go that way. Then this one's going to stay unsewn for now. Then we're going to do the same thing down here. One more row of 3. Snip that out. I just use little tiny scraps. Sometimes when you're cutting, you end up with like a 1/2 inch strip of fabric. What are you going to do with it? You can't really sew that into a quilt 1/2 inch. seam allowances, there's no fabric left. So I use those for the little, I call them thread catchers, but they work. It keeps the thread from pulling out of the needle. It just keeps me sewing straight lines a little easier without having to worry about where the thread's at. You get gunked up thread under the needle ever. We just keep sewing. Some people call those leaders and enders. Some people make actual sewing projects out of the leader and ender idea, that there's always a piece of fabric under the needle so your thread is never loose and wonky. Make sure those seam allowances go the right way. Spray and press. Just lay those down. These ones are also going to go off to my left side. I'm not sure they look left to you, but that's going to lay to the left. All right, here's where things get fun. These seams are going to nest together. They really will, I promise. We're going to take a row of 5 and we're going to lay it on this row of 7. And all those seam allowances line right up. Since these are going in opposite directions, these folds, there's an amazing ability that it just nests together beautifully. Here's what I like to do though, just to make sure my squares stay straight and that my seam allowances come together in nice crisp little points. The piece that's on the bottom is going to go under my presser foot. And so I'm going to I'm going to pin whichever fabric is going to go under the presser foot first. So, and I always pin away from me. So I put that in on the seam allowance so that it holds the seam allowance still. So going under the needle is going to be a little bit easier because it can't shift as easily. So I just rub the fabrics together until those seams nest up beautifully, and then I put a pin in there right into the edge of that seam allowance, and I do that all the way along the strip. Try to make sure that that pin gets in there into that last little, into the actual seam allowance. When I sew this, I'm not sewing that 1/4 inch. I try to make sure those pins kind of hit into that last little bit so that point comes together as well as possible. All right, that's done. So it's longer on one side than on the other because we're going from 7 to 5. That's okay, that's how it's supposed to be. So you're just going to sew. Yes, I'm going to sew through the single layer. Why? Because it's just easier for me. I don't have to worry about trying to lift the needle and up and down and move it. So as I sew, I tend to pull my pins out. It's a bigger pin. I really like the ultra fine pins because they just sew right over them. Once I've sewn past it, I just pull them out. So it doesn't take long to do. I'm just lining that foot up. Some of these have those pinked edges, and I'm lining my 1/4 inch foot up with the inner part of that pinking. Oops, I missed that needle, didn't I? The joys of being able to sew right past them. Sometimes you miss 1 or 2. Done. Just snip that off. Snip off this layer. And then I'm going to lay it down on my ironing board. I'm going to fold it with my hands so I can see what I'm doing. I'm just going to press that real quick. I'm pressing from the center out. I folded it, and it doesn't really matter. It does matter that it goes from the center of the block, from the white is our very centerpiece, right? So I'm folding it to the outside so that that seam allowance is backing the littler piece. It'll matter downstream as we put these blocks together a little bit more. I'm going to do the same thing with this block of 3. I'm going to line it up. These seam allowances still folded in opposite directions. So now the top piece is going to go under the needle first. So it looks like I'm pinning different, but it's really exactly the same. It's just seam allowances being caught, and these things are just being helped along by that nesting ability. Just nest them all together. I have a tendency when they're misaligned like that, that this one is a whole block extra. I match up the seam allowance where I can and just put a pin in that leading edge, just so that as it goes under the presser foot, it stays flat. My fingers help do that, but insurance and having that pin there. I'm just going to sew again with a 1/4 inch all the way along. You know, this video might be a little lengthy. I'm going to try and edit it a little bit. I don't want you to miss the steps. Alrighty. So you can just wait till the end and pull your pins, however you prefer to do it. Ordinarily I pull as I go, but apparently today it's not normal. Tiny bit more of that. I think it's an addiction. We'll press this out. The pressure. I make all of this come together. Now I have one more block. We're going to line up. I can see my seam allowance right here. And I'm going to make sure that this new block is lined up with that leading edge's seam allowance. And I'm going to pin that into place. I don't want it to move, especially not at this juncture. So I'm just going to make sure that that's lined up properly, 1/4 inch all the way along, and then that block matches that seam allowance. I'm going to sew one more time on this edge. Pin holds that still for me. And that half of the block is done. I'll flip that final block over. Press. That whole half of the block is done. We're getting there. Can you see it? See it coming together? Now we're going to do the same thing for the other half. We're going to fold the 5 up onto the 7, and I'm going to pin it into place again. The leading edge, I normally start pinning in the center of these kinds of blocks. I don't know why. Just have it. Just work from the inside out like normal. But I just pin along. Make sure they nest and that the edge is lined up well. Pin. One more pin here, just since that's my leading edge. Wiggle, wiggle. Make sure these nest up right. This other one too. Nest it all up. I don't normally pin the tail end. You can if you'd like to, but it's not required. Then I'm just going to sew down the other side. All right, here we go. Bottom piece isn't pinned, I do want to just make sure it's lined up right. All right, then we're going to flip it out from the center again, just fold it over. Press it by hand and add a little steam. Technically, this already had best press done when I did the sideways rows, so all I'm doing is reactivating it with a little bit of steam. You can add a bit more if you'd like it to be a little firmer. I'll probably do it on the next row. We'll do it again one more time with this row of 3. Again, just lining it up. Since our seam allowances were carefully laid out, this is pretty easy. Just have to line them up and nest it all out. And whatever edge you're sewing, that's the edge we're going to pin. All right, here goes our row of 3 on the row of 5. To pin that from the bottom, but I pinned the leading edge, so it doesn't really matter. I'm going to press that one out. I tangle myself up in my iron cord. I'm more careful about that. I'm going to press those corners. Some people really don't like to pin the blocks. Some people don't mind. The reason that it matters is if you look at this, every one of these intersections is pretty much perfect. They all come together. There's not a lot of overlap. There's no gapping. They're just perfect little corner intersections. And that's the benefit of pinning those leading edges. Here's our last one. I'll line that up. Make sure the seam allowance is accurate. Pin that leading edge here. Sew that last little block in place. Little block to press open, and again just folding away from the center and pressing. Wasn't so bad, was it? A little bit of sewing, but not bad. Alrighty, there is my first block. Set those there. The next thing we need to do is trim down the block. According to the directions, this should be about a 9.5 inch, a 9-inch block, I think is what they told me. 9-inch block? About 9 inches. This is a 9.5 inch ruler, so it's slightly bigger than what I need, but rulers are easy enough to make line up where we want them to. I did note in the directions, this is something kind of important, because some of these edges are raw as they come across and line up. It said that it gave 9 inches, and that would actually give us approximately a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance instead of just a 1/4 inch. So I'm just lining it up to make sure that I have it straight. This is an important thing. So I'm lining up all the way along, just making sure that this is very square with where I'm cutting. So the two edges that I'm cutting first are the top and the side, because those are the two I can get in one fell swoop. But I can see where my 9-inch lines are, and I like the way this looks, so I'm going to go ahead and cut now. So the first swipe I'm going to go backwards just a little bit, just because my ruler's not quite long enough, but not very far. And then I'll just go to the end. Lots of little triangles. And we're going to cut along the top. I haven't moved anything. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4. Those are done. I'm going to turn my block 180 degrees. The joys of having that first edge cut is now all I have to do is line it up on that 9-inch line. And everything ought to be fairly accurate, but I'm seeing I might want to give it just a smidge. This is not a perfect science. Give it just a smidge more to the one side. I'll trim off that other edge again. So that part's done. Across the top. All those little triangles. I'll line it up one more time and just make sure I'm really happy with the seam allowances. Lots of little pieces here. I normally have a tiny little kitchen bowl, and I normally just scoop all these off and drop them into the bowl, but for some reason today I set that aside. Just turn it 90 degrees and give it one more final square look. That's perfect. I like it. I'm going to trim off this edge at the top one more time. There's our first block. So these are all biased edges on these triangles, and they look beautiful, but like I said, just be careful as you sew these together. Once we've done 30 of these, the next step is going to be to cut sashing strips in between. So you're going to, okay, this isn't our sashing, but I'm going to grab it just as an example. If this block is 9 inches, and it is, I'm going to cut my sashing strips at 9 inches. And we're just going to line the sashing strips up. I'm showing you this with a contrasting color for clarification. Normally this would be the same as my background, that peachy tone or coral. So we cut these at 9-inch strips in between. I think you need 4 of those to go 5 blocks across, 6 rows down. We're going to sew 5 blocks a week for 6 weeks. So you can take your time with this. If you don't get your fabric in this week, I know with the quarantine everyone's having issues getting their fabrics. If you haven't gotten them yet, don't stress. If you miss the first week, not a big deal. Just add an extra block. So sew 6 blocks a week instead of 5. You're still going to end up with 30 squares. That last week we'll go ahead and cut all those sashing strips, and I'll help you sew those. If you have any questions, feel free to message me. I would always love to be able to help you with that. I think this is going to be a lot of fun. The joys of it is it doesn't have to be the same exact pattern. This jelly roll has all sorts of different prints. So the next one might be, you know, a tiny bit of green and then gray and then the peach. And so there's all sorts of options. I do have lots of other versions of the coral, so some of those will play. I probably won't put them in the sashing, in this outer ring, but I'll probably try and mix in some of these bright corals into the middle too, so that they can get used. It's going to be beautiful. I'm looking forward to seeing how this turns out. Thanks for hanging out with me, guys. I appreciate you. If you need anything, let me know. Take care.